She was happy. She was beautiful. She was just wrapped up with the most beautiful bow. But we didn't have a lot of time with her.
He grabbed me by the throat and told me if I screamed or said anything that he would tear my throat open.
She had been raped.
I'm really frightened.
The man raped her in her car, then drove her to his house where he sexually assaulted her again.
I think that's where this nightmare begins.
Anger. He had a lot of anger.
You didn't respect women very much.
That's a dangerous man.
He looked at me and said, "This is not going to trial."
He began to formulate this burning desire to kill Joyce Yost.
And he did say, "It's going to be done if I can do it myself."
Statistically, rapists don't return to murder the person, so...
She believed that she was able to take care of herself. She was telling the truth. You ruined a lot of people's lives. You know what? You're going to prison for what you did to me. She vanished. We all knew that it wasn't good.
Hello and welcome to our very first Q&A session for Cold Season 2. I'm Becky Bruce and I'm back with Dave Cawley, probably a familiar face and voice to those of you who follow the Cold podcast. And Dave, it feels kind of strange to be doing this in a different location, but it's good to see you, man.
Yeah, I miss being in the studio with you. We all adjust, and actually this is pretty cool that we can do this remote like this. So let's get to it.
Yeah, it works out. It works out. So let's start with this particular case, Justice for Joyce Yost. Why this case?
It's a bit of a complicated answer to that question. But in the simple reason that we chose to focus on Joyce Yost for Cold Season 2 was the importance of bringing her voice forward. Joyce is somebody who disappeared in 1985. Her case in many people's minds has been, I guess, solved. It's similar to the Josh and Susan Powell case in Season 1 in that we have a very firm idea of who killed Joyce, who made her disappear. But it's the background to that investigation, to that story, and the unresolved nature of it, because Joyce's body has never been found, that really parallels what we saw in Season 1. As this case came to my attention through a colleague here at KSL, and we started digging into the records, very quickly I realized there probably was a recording of Joyce Yost reporting this horrific crime that happened to her in April of 1985 that had never been heard. It was, in my eyes, probably the best chance we would ever have to give Joyce the platform to tell her story in a way that has never been done before. So long story short, that is why we chose Joyce Yost for Cold Season 2.
Well, how do I listen? Is it free? Where do I find it?
Right. So obviously in the last number of weeks, we have been trying to get the word out that a big shift is coming for Cold Season 2. We're moving exclusively to Amazon. I know a lot of people have opinions about that, and rightfully so. It is a big change, but the good news is Cold Season 2 remains free to listen. Right now, you'll find episode 1 of Season 2 anywhere you get your podcasts. So people who are still subscribed from Season 1, it should automatically roll up in your podcast app of choice. But starting next week after the episode 2 drop, all future episodes will be coming to Amazon Music. That means that you have to use the free Amazon Music app and follow Cold there to get the rest of the episodes. We've heard a lot from people on social media saying, hey, I'm in Australia, or I'm, in some region where Amazon Music podcasts are not supported. Does this mean I can't listen? The answer to that is yes, you can listen, but you just have to take one extra step, which is go to thecoldpodcast.com, click into the article for the episode. There will be a player there that you can use to get to each episode. So it's not as slick as having it show up in your podcast app, but we wanted to make sure that even our international listeners had that opportunity to follow along.
Yeah, we've already got one person commenting that they love that music from Michael Bondmiller. And I don't know about you, but the first time I got to hear it again, it really felt like, okay, Cold is coming back. We're into this.
Well, and Michael did a wonderful job. We asked him to give us a whole slate of new themes to go along with Joyce. And one of the asks that we made of him was, can you give us that same music, but make it fresh? And you'll notice if you listen close, it's the same music, but also with a little bit of a twist to identify it as being somewhat distinct for season 2. The score this time around, our audio producer Nina Ernest has done a wonderful job, far better than I did with season 1, quite frankly, in helping establish the mood through the music. And I'm excited for people to hear that work.
So I have heard from some folks who are just really confused by all of the places and the people and the names, especially in episode 1. What's your response to that?
Right. They're right. It's a bit of I can't think of a better analogy than a fire hose to try to introduce not only Joyce Yost, her family, and getting her from her home state here to Utah, establishing her kids, some of her work history, how people knew her around here. But at the same time, also giving you some background on Doug Lovell. My hope is that the worst of it is just here in episode 1, that if people can bear with us, once we get to episode 2 next week, it will really slow down and become a lot more clear who is who and how these relationships matter to the story. In the meantime, recognizing that feedback and quite honestly, myself as the writer of this, feeling like I did kind of a poor job in helping people follow that along, we have put together a who's who list that shows up on the Cold Podcast website. And we will be updating that throughout the run of the series, adding names and relationships so that if anyone ever has a question, they can come back to that master list and say, okay, yeah, that's who, Royce Lovell is Doug Lovell's brother. And I see how that connects. Another thing that we long promised to do with season 1, but continually fell by the wayside, that we are still working on, but promising to do here in season 2 as well, is we are going to be putting transcriptions of the episodes online as well, so that if you want to go back and scan just text for a particular piece of the story, or you want to follow along that way, or for anybody who is quite honestly hard of hearing, we believe strongly in accessibility, and we want to make that available to everybody.
So what would you want people to take away about Joyce? What do you want them to know about her?
The tough thing with a story like this is Joyce, when she disappeared in 1985, it was a time when we didn't have smartphones, we didn't have digital cameras. And so the record establishing who Joyce was in photos, or like with Susan Powell in episode 1, her personal correspondence, which because she was using MySpace and Facebook and emails, was all collected and available to police when they began their investigation, and subsequently was made available to us with those case records. Nothing like that exists for Joyce Yost. And so the job of trying to help you get to know Joyce is a little more difficult. We have to go back and try to find, her friends, her family members, people that knew her. And after this amount of time, many of them are, I think, hesitant to share their stories because it's a painful memory. What I would like people to remember or to know about Joyce Yost is just what a devoted mother she was, what a hard-working person she was. We hear from her kids in this episode that she often worked 2 or 3 jobs to provide. She, at many points in their growing up years, was acting as a single mother and breadwinner for the entire family. And I think you have to look at the culture in the 70s and 80s and recognize, Joyce was living in a place with very conservative, I guess you would say, values, and that had to have been a somewhat difficult situation for her. Yet she was an optimist. She devoted her life to providing for her kids and making sure that they never went without. And she also was somebody who loved making other people look good. We know that she spent a lot of time in her job working in fashion and cosmetics. Already, we've seen messages on social media from people who have listened to episode 1 and say, "Hey, I remember being a little girl and seeing Joyce at the cosmetics counter at ZCMI," and I just think that's so wonderful that we can help bring those memories back and share who Joyce was with people.
So, on a flip side of that, why do we get so much detail about Doug in this episode? Why is that important?
We're going to get to know Doug Lovell very well in the course of this podcast. Doug did not speak to me, and we'll get into why maybe that is toward the end of the season. But starting with episode 2, you are going to see Doug and Joyce come together in the same place and at the same time. I felt it was important that the listener have the context of understanding Doug Lovell's background before bringing he and Joyce together in the same place. Because while Joyce didn't know anything about who he was at the time, when we see the aftermath of what's going to happen in episode 2, it's useful to know where he was coming from. One of our big goals with Cold, this was true in season 1 and it remains true in season 2, is trying to make sure that we don't devote focus to the so-called, I don't want to say bad people, the perpetrators in these cases, for lack of a better term. But you do have to have that balance. I have to help you understand who Lovell is, at the same time respecting Joyce and keeping her at the forefront of our story.
Our next question is from somebody named Jessica, and it reminds me that I haven't done a very good job setting the stage here. And that question is, has Joyce's body ever been found? So why don't we talk a little bit about that, but also the background?
Sure. And it's no secret to say, part of the reason that we picked this case is because there is that unresolved nature of it. Just like with the Susan Powell case, Joyce Yost has never been found. Her family, her children, her friends, the people that I've talked to, the people that investigated her disappearance, still hope that at some point they will be able to close that loop and bring Joyce home. You know, with the Susan Powell case in season 1, we were looking at about a 10-year span. And now, you know, going back to 2009, it's just growing longer as time goes by. And with Joyce, when you start realizing, yeah, these cases can go unresolved like that for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. It highlights to me how that trauma and loss can become multi-generational. You know, with Susan Powell, we heard a lot from her parents. Well, Joyce Yost's parents are long deceased. And I can talk to her kids, I can talk to her grandkids, but her grandkids have kids. I mean, this is cascading generation after generation. And so the fact that she has never been found is important to identify, also to recognize that that is not a wound that has closed for that family.
Yeah, we had an interesting conversation on KSL News Radio this week with the Utah Cold Case Coalition, kind of along those lines. You know, I was staggered to find out how many missing persons cases there are that are open in the US right now, but also how many unidentified bodies there are in the US that have never been able to provide their families closure. It's kind of a staggering problem.
It really is. If you look at Utah, Utah has established its own cold case database. It's publicly available. You can go look. And in fact, if you search Joyce Yost right now, you will see her name and picture on that list, along with many, many others. When Joyce disappeared in 1985, DNA forensics was actually not a thing. I mean, it was this case really predated modern forensics that way. And it wasn't until, 10 or 15 years ago that police were able to go back to her children and collect their DNA to put it into the national database, so that in the case that somebody maybe someday locates unidentified remains, they would be able to potentially run DNA on that and try to get a match off of, her immediate family. But it's a staggering problem, and we can focus on one case at a time with cold, but hopefully help illustrate the broader problem that these cases present.
Sure. And speaking of the impact on those families, Kelly Carter is asking, how did Susan and Joyce's family receive the podcast?
I don't want to speak for them. I will say with Susan Powell's family, I think it probably depends on the individual. I've had the opportunity to speak with Chuck Cox and his wife on multiple occasions. We obviously put a huge spotlight on that case, and they were not unfamiliar, having been, profiled on cable shows and documentaries and all that kind of stuff. And so I think in large part they were appreciative and supportive, probably took issue with, some pieces of the story. With Joyce's story, it's a little different because she has not had that exposure. Joyce's case has been covered in the local media off and on for the last 35 years. But to my knowledge, nobody has ever sat down and done a complete beginning to end, go into all the details on her case. And you don't see, her children on Dateline, for instance. And so it's a much more private thing for them. I feel like they have extended a great deal of trust to me and to KSL and Cold to tell this story. And my hope would be that even though it's probably very difficult for them to listen to this and hear the story, that they can appreciate the respect with which we try to do that job.
A little bit of a different question here. In fact, I don't think anybody's ever asked us this one. Is there any cold merch on the way?
No, and let me tell you why. It is a conversation that we had when we were originally pushing out Cold Season 1. We don't want to be in a position of trying to make this kind of storytelling about selling stuff, if that makes sense. Obviously, I work for a living, you work for a living. KSL is a for-profit entity. We do have ads that appear in our shows that help cover our expenses. Likewise, with our partnership with Amazon, that provides us financial stability to do what we do. But I think collectively we felt like going out and selling merch would, in a way, commercialize something that just feels like it ought not to be.
That makes a lot of sense to me. Of course, I work here, so I know how we operate, but I couldn't believe nobody had ever asked me that before. So you never know.
It is a thought that, we did talk about it and kind of debate ethically, were we comfortable with it? And I feel good in saying, yeah, it's probably not the right thing for that.
That does remind me, though, at various different times, have there been other kind of ethical considerations that have come up for you as you've been reporting both Susan and Joyce's stories?
Yes. We're going to see in episode 2 coming up next week what I consider to be probably the most ethically challenging piece of story I've ever had to navigate, because this season we are talking about a case that involves rape and sexual assault. And I, as a white man in society stepping into that space, feel like I have so much to learn, and I want to be absolutely sure that what we put out into the world is responsible and respectful. But Joyce isn't here for me to sit down and talk to her about what she's comfortable with sharing. And so we've had to be very thoughtful. We have some disagreement even within our own team about where the boundaries are, what the limits are of what we should say, shouldn't say, how we say it, how we address some of these topics. And part of that discussion has actually prompted something new for season 2 that we are going to do, which is a companion podcast called Talking Cold, which will be helmed specifically by women and talking about some of these issues, giving them hopefully platform to wrap some more context and conversation around it, so that we're doing the best job we can to stay on the right side ethically.
Here's another good question about the background of the case. What's the latest with Doug Lovell? Where is he right now?
So Doug Lovell is at the Utah State Prison. We will eventually in the story catch up to, of course, modern day. But just as an overview, he has been in prison since 1986. He has basically lived the majority of his life there at this point. Doug Lovell actually reached out to a colleague of mine and yours, Becky, Candace Madsen, around the same time that I was wrapping up season 1 of Cold. He wrote Candace a letter because he had heard her on the airwaves of KSL News Radio and wanted to share his perspective on suicide prevention, which was the topic Candace was talking about. And Candace at that point wasn't very familiar with Doug. I certainly wasn't. But she started doing some research and actually did a lot of the original digging on this case for what you're hearing come out in season 2, and recognized that he, even after all this time, even though there's no question of his culpability in our story, is attempting to get out of prison. And so that becomes a big part in the later part of the season, is looking at the kind of the status of the case, the system, how those appeals have worked, and all of that kind of stuff.
I know in season 1, we talked a lot about preventing domestic abuse, but also providing resources for people experiencing it. And it seems like in this season, kind of the focal point is more about sexual assault and rape. How are you spreading that awareness and that message?
As we did with season 1, every episode will end with a call to action, which is essentially that, if you or somebody has experienced rape or sexual abuse of any kind, that we want to provide you the resources to get help, to talk to somebody, to, if you feel like you can or should, to report it. This case is one of the more rare rape cases in that it focuses on a stranger assault. Joyce Yost didn't know Doug Lovell when he first approached her, which we will get to in episode 2 next week. It's much more common and more likely that people who are raped or sexually assaulted know the person who did it. And we know that many, if not most, of those survivors choose not to report for very valid reasons. So again, this is a place where we are hoping that our companion podcast will give us more of an opportunity outside the narrative of the case, which I will be talking about, to address some of those issues. Why do so many survivors choose not to report? What are the drawbacks of going forward with reporting a case like that? And what can we do better? How can we individually and as a broader society better protect and support survivors of rape and sexual assault? It's a happy coincidence that we are in the middle of a month, April, that is focused on sexual assault awareness. We want to use the opportunity of Joyce's case to talk about the fact that many people experience these kinds of traumatic events, these crimes, and all too often, not just the criminal justice system, but I think individually we fall short in telling survivors, especially women in American society, globally, that we hear them, that we believe them, that we support them, and that we're going to do everything we can to protect them.
Thanks, Dave. I've noticed a number of people reaching out to us, as they did, honestly, with domestic abuse experiences in the first season, to say, you know, I'm a survivor and I really appreciate the respect with which you're handling the case. I think that's an important conversation that maybe we can help shine a light on.
Yeah, I hope so. And I'll be perfectly frank. I feel so inadequate to that task of stepping into that space. But one thing that I saw over and over again talking about domestic abuse with Josh and Susan Powell was that even if I don't get it right all the time, I can learn a lot from the people who are hearing that story and are sharing their experiences. And so, to anybody out there who listens to Cold Season 2, who hears Joyce's story, if I screw up, if I say something that steps over a line, please let me know. Help me learn and understand, but also let's kind of break down some of that stigma and have an honest and frank conversation about this problem, because I strongly believe nothing gets better if we don't respectfully talk to one another.
Anything you can tell me about episode 2 coming up next week, or episode 3, which I believe is also coming up next week?
Yeah, so that's the big thing. We're doing a double drop next week. With episode 2, I will caution, it is going to be probably the most difficult episode of the Cold podcast to listen to, which is saying a lot considering where we went in season 1. Think about if you really want to listen to it, and who you're sharing it with, before you hit that play button. We'll give you plenty of warning before we go into the episode to make clear that is a decision that you should think about, because episode 2 will focus on the sexual assault, the rape of Joyce Yost on the night of April 3rd, 1985, and what happened in the hours immediately following. At the conclusion of episode 2, which will be available across all podcast platforms, we will be making that exclusive switch to Amazon. So at the same time episode 2 drops, available everywhere next week, episode 3 will also become available on Amazon Music. And then episode 3 picks up where the story ends in episode 2 and carries us forward to the last night that Joyce was seen alive, and the schemes and machinations that were taking place that she was completely unaware of during the 4 months between her rape and her disappearance. That's what's coming next week.
All right. Thanks so much for taking the time. For anybody who has questions about how to find it or where, we have got some links for you that we'll put on our social media channels, just so you can keep up to date. In the meantime, if you have other questions, we're going to keep doing these regular conversations about once a week if we can. I think we're going to move them to Fridays starting next week, but we'll be here. And in the meantime, the Amazon Music app is free, and so there is no paywall. We hope you can give it a listen and join us next week. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Becky. Appreciate it.
Yep.